June 18, 1815. On a damp Belgian field, the fate of Europe was not decided by a single bullet or a lone charge, but by a sequence of choices, delays, and desperate clashes that together closed a chapter of continental war. This was Waterloo, an epic clash at which Napoleonic warfare reached a decisive turning point, where speed, terrain, command, and the will of disparate armies collided and altered the map of Europe. In 1814, Napoleon had been forced from power, sent into exile on the island of Elba, while the Bourbon monarchy returned to Paris. The Peace Congress in Vienna promised a new order, but the continent was uneasy and the old loyalties remained fragile. In March 1815, Napoleon slipped back into France, gathered supporters, and re-entered power for the period historians call the 100 Days. Europe responded by mobilizing the coalition. Armies converged, governments prepared, and commanders readied for a campaign that would either end Napoleon's ambitions for good or permit a dramatic comeback. Napoleon's plan in Belgium was surgically bold. He intended to strike the enemy in detail, to separate Wellington's Anglo-Allied army from Blücher's Prussians, defeat them separately, and force a political settlement from strength. It was a gamble based on speed and decisive action. In late June 1815, his troops crossed into what is now Belgium and pushed toward Charleroi, seeking to interpose themselves between the Allied forces before they could join. The strategy unfolded quickly and violently. On June 16, two fights erupted almost simultaneously. At Ligny, Napoleon confronted Blücher. The French won a contested victory and drove the Prussians back, but they did not destroy the Prussian army. Blücher withdrew in good order enough to fight another day. At Quatre Bras, Marshal Ney held Wellington's forces in place. Neither Allied column was annihilated. Both remained intact, battered and cautious, and the stage was set for a final, decisive encounter near the village of Waterloo. If Napoleon hoped to finish the campaign in a single blow, Wellington refused to be caught in the open. The Duke selected his ground with care, anchoring his army on a gentle ridge about a mile south of the village of Waterloo. The slope itself mattered. From the crest, troops could stand just out of direct sight and then descend to deliver volleys at approaching columns. To anchor the position and deny the French easy avenues, Wellington placed strong points at several farm complexes: Hougoumont on his right, La Haye-Sault near the center, and Papelotte and Plancenoit on his left. These farms were not mere outbuildings. They were strongholds that shaped the flow of combat, funnels that could anchor lines, slow attackers, and offer cover for muskets and artillery. Wellington's hope was simple: hold the ridge until Prussian help arrived. The morning of the 18th brought more than the army's nerves. Overnight rain turned approach roads into clay. Mud became an adversary. The French artillery and heavy columns could not move with the rapidity Napoleon needed, and early attacks would be blunted not only by musket and cannon, but by the earth itself. In warfare of this era, timing was everything, and the weather had its own design. At first light, some French actions were unmistakably probing. Others were meant to pin and divert. Hougoumont, a complex of orchards, hedges, gates, and buildings on Wellington's right, became a locus of violence. French troops tested the defenses. Wellington's men defended stubbornly. For hours, small parties fought over courtyards and gates. At one point, assault teams forced a breach in the outer yard. Defenders held to the inner buildings and closed gates behind them. Hougoumont's defenders never quit, and in doing so, they drew significant French men and attention into a bloody contest that Napoleon hoped would be merely a distraction. Instead, the farm absorbed a disproportionate share of French effort. Across the field, French cannon grew louder. Heavy bombardment aimed to soften the Allied line, to create openings for infantry columns. But Wellington's troops, British, Dutch, Belgians, Germans, and other contingents, formed disciplined defenses. When French cavalry arrived and saw infantry advancing without sufficient supporting artillery or bayonets, Wellington's troops formed squares.
tight, hollow rectangles of infantry bristling with bayonets on every side. Forming square was a defensive tactic designed to repel cavalry. Horsemen could not penetrate the dense fence of bayonets and became vulnerable to close-range musketry and canister shot. From the ridge, volley after volley crashed into advancing lines. The battlefield filled with smoke, thunder, and the staccato of repeated volleys. The mud swallowed up wheels and boots. The smell of powder and churned earth dominated the air. Marshal Ney's decisions that day would become a focal point for criticism and analysis. At one crucial moment, he committed massed cavalry in a massive, repeated series of charges against the Allied center, thousands of horsemen sweeping down the slope. They hit British squares and artillery batteries with ferocious momentum, yet without adequate infantry to follow up and without close artillery suppression, cavalry could not break well-formed infantry squares. Horses and men dashed themselves against the defensive hedges of bayonet points. Many cavalrymen were cut down by grape shot and musketry. Others plunged into muddy ditches or were hurled back by poisoned fire. In the chaos, Major Sir William Ponsonby, a brigade commander, led a charge of heavy cavalry, and, like many in that furious contest, was killed in the melee. His death became one of the notable personal losses recorded among the Allied ranks. Ponsonby's fall was emblematic. Courage and momentum were not enough without combined arms support.
While Ney's cavalry battered itself and French infantry probed into La Haye-Sainte, elsewhere the campaign's larger arithmetic was shifting. Napoleon had detached Marshal Grouchy with some 30,000 men to pursue the retreating Prussians and prevent them from rejoining Wellington. Grouchy engaged at Wavre and fought a competent action there, but he could not ascertain the full movements of the Prussian main body nor detach sufficient force to stop Blücher's march toward Waterloo. Communication problems, uncertain terrain, and the fog of war limited Grouchy's options. By the late afternoon, Prussian columns were converging onto Napoleon's right flank. La Haye-Sainte, the farmhouse near the center of Wellington's line, had been a linchpin. Defended initially by King's German Legion infantry, it endured repeated assaults. Its fall to the French later in the afternoon allowed French artillery to come into closer range and to pound Allied formations more effectively. But capturing La Haye-Sainte cost the French dearly and came too late to secure a decisive breach. Each meter of ground was paid for with blood and exhausted men. Then, as a leaden late afternoon settled, the sound of Prussian boots rose from the east. Blücher, despite his earlier setback, had resolved to march his battered army back into the fight. The Prussian arrival was not a simple reinforcement. It forced Napoleon to do something he had been striving to avoid: commit his strategic reserve. Plancenoit, the village to the right of the French line, became the locus where the Prussians struck. Blücher's troops attacked fiercely to hold the ground and to threaten the French rear. Napoleon responded by diverting troops, including the Imperial Guard, in local defense of the village to check the Prussian advance. The Imperial Guard was not just another unit. It represented Napoleon's elite, seasoned veterans, a symbol of French martial prestige and the last strategic reserve. To commit the Guard was to declare that everything now depended on its success. As dusk approached, when the French line had been hammered by artillery and many formations were thinning, Napoleon ordered the Guard forward in a final attempt to break the Allied center and secure victory. The Guard advanced in tight formation, banners lowered, the battlefield lit by cannon flashes. For a moment, the assault had the hush of inevitability, the best troops in Europe moving with practiced discipline toward a breakthrough. From the ridge came concentrated musketry and artillery. At the same time, Prussian pressure intensified on the French right. The Guard met a wall of coordinated fire. British and Allied battalions counterattacked wherever they could, and the arrival of Prussian units on the French flank and rear amplified the pressure. The Guard's assault faltered. Once steadfast men began to fall back under a storm of shot and bayonet. When the elite began to give, the fragile cohesion of the French army unraveled into panic and rout. Command and control collapsed, formations dissolved into flight. Night descended on a field littered with the detritus of combat. Shattered wagons, burned artillery limbers, drums, discarded uniforms, the groans of the wounded, and scattered bodies. Combined casualties on both sides numbered in the tens of thousands, around 50,000 killed, wounded, and missing by contemporary accounts, a human price that cannot be romanticized. Napoleon's army was broken as a fighting force that day. Within weeks, the emperor abdicated once more. He surrendered to the British and was sent into exile on St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic where he would live out his final years. Strategically, Waterloo closed the Napoleonic era. The coalition secured a long period of relative peace in Europe, a century shaped by a balance of power and diplomatic congresses that sought to prevent another eruption on the scale of the Napoleonic Wars. Politically, Waterloo ended Napoleon's bid to impose a renewed hegemony. Militarily, the battle illustrated several enduring lessons: the decisive role of timely coordination among allies, the importance of reserves and their judicious use, the vulnerability of cavalry without combined arms support, and how terrain and weather could dictate operational tempo. Yet amid this sweep of grand analysis, the day is also full of individual human stories that survive in small images. Blücher, the indomitable Prussian marshal, was seen on the field where his horse was killed beneath him. The loss of the horse became a single, stark image of the cost paid, even by commanders. Major Ponsonby's killing during the cavalry shocks reverberated among the units who had watched a leader fall. Decades later, photographers found veterans from both sides, faces lined and eyes reflective, posing in memory of a day that had once consumed them in smoke and terror. Those photographs, weathered men in civilian dress, the medals and scars visible, link the tactical and the personal, reminding us that strategic points of history are measured also by private sorrows and quiet survivals. Why then does Waterloo stand as a turning point in Napoleonic warfare? Because it combined operational missteps, the failure to sever Allied coordination, and the exhaustion of French tactical options into a single decisive moment. Napoleon's concept of striking quickly at the separated Allies failed, when delays, terrain, and the stubborn resistance at key strongpoints like Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte slowed the tempo. Ney's cavalry, brave but unsupported, burned itself out. Grouchy's inability to fix the Prussians allowed Blücher to re-enter the fight. And when the Imperial Guard, the symbol and last hope of French resurgence, was committed and repulsed, the myth of invincibility shattered.
Waterloo did not merely end a battle. It ended an era of Napoleonic expansion, signaling that the balance of power would now be mediated by coalitions and diplomacy rather than by the will of a single conqueror. The field of Waterloo has been painted and analyzed, diagrammed and filmed, but its core lesson remains practical and stark. Wars are won not only by battlefield valor, but by logistics, timing, intelligence, and the hard arithmetic of coalition politics. The rain that morning, the closed gates at Hougoumont, the squares on the ridge, a fallen brigade commander, a missed chance to isolate the Prussians, these details compounded into a decisive whole. In the years that followed, leaders and students of war studied Waterloo for its tactics and for its broader meaning. Generations of officers learned about combined arms coordination, about preserving a reserve and using it with precision, and about the risks of fragmenting strategic focus. Europe's map stabilized into a period where wars would be less frequent and often mediated by congresses and treaties, a respite shaped directly by the outcome that day. Waterloo was epic in scale and intimate in consequence. It was the culmination of Napoleon's daring and his mistakes, of Wellington's defensive acumen and resolve, and of Blücher's tenacity. It was a battlefield where personal courage and national stakes braided together. It was, finally, a turning point, not because one shot changed everything, but because a sequence of events, tactical, environmental, human, converged until an empire's ambitions were finally checked. If this account has sparked your interest in how strategy and human choice shape history, subscribe for more deep breakdowns of pivotal battles and the decisions that made them. In the meantime, remember that history's turning points are rarely moments of simple fate. They are lessons in contingency, leadership, and the stubborn realities of warfare. The images remain: a ruined field, veterans posing decades later with medals and memories, the smoke settling on ground where plans met reality. Those faces and places remind us that Waterloo was not just a historical line item. It was an epic clash whose consequences shaped Europe for a generation, and whose lessons endure for anyone who studies the making and unmaking of empires. If you found this illuminating, like and share this video, and check the link to our map breakdown for a visual reconstruction of the troop movements that decided that day.